Live. Hello and welcome to A Mighty Blaze. My name is Kimberly Hensle Lowrance, and I'm the co-host of A Mighty Blaze's Authors Love Bookstores, which broadcasts on Wednesdays. But today I have the distinct honor of stepping into the host shoes here on our Frontliner interview series to welcome best-selling author Susan Orlean to the show. Welcome, Susan.
Very happy to be with you.
We're thrilled that you're here. For our audience, if you are a regular Blaze viewer, welcome back. We're happy to have you. And if you're new to the Blaze, also welcome. And know that we are a team of 35 creative professionals based all over the US who came together at the beginning of COVID to create a way to help promote books, authors, and to connect readers and writers during this time of COVID and beyond. We'll be happy to take your questions during the show today. You can ask them by posting a comment below the broadcast, whether you're watching on Facebook or YouTube. Okay, now to our guest. Susan Orlean has been a staff writer for The New Yorker since 1992, and she has contributed to many other publications, including Vogue, Rolling Stone, Esquire, Outside, and the Boston Globe. She's published 12 books, including the library book, which I adore, and The Orchid Thief, which I have right here. And this was made into a movie with Meryl Streep. She's also written many other books, including RIN TIN TIN, My Kind of Place, travel stories from a woman who's been everywhere, The Bullfighter Checks Her Makeup, and now her latest book, on animals, which is what we'll be discussing today. Susan has a regular column for Medium. She runs a book club for literati. She's a prolific public speaker, and she writes for television. She's also the person you absolutely must follow on Twitter. And you're joining us today from Los Angeles. Is that correct, Susan?
That's right. That's right. I'm at home doing everything through the miracle of the internet.
What you've done a couple of events live in person, but most of your book tour has been virtual.
You know, I've really only done 2 live events. I did an event in Los Angeles and then one in New York. And otherwise, it's all been virtual. We were hoping up until the very last minute that I could do things live, but it just seems most venues aren't quite ready to do that. It's a shame because I love talking to a live audience, but I'm glad we can have at least the capacity to talk through an online conversation.
Well, the feedback and the reviews for On Animals, it's been fantastic. So this is a collection for our audience that hasn't yet read this book. This is a collection of essays that you have written about animals, and you've written these over the last 20 years or so.
Yeah.
And the reviews, I mean, they really are wonderful. Kirk has said, another winner featuring the author's trademark blend of meticulous research and scintillating writing. Anytime you can use the word scintillating in a sentence.
I know.
I'm there, right?
Yep, that's a good one.
The New York Times described this book as magnificent, mesmerizing, brilliant, funny, and fascinating. Also excellent. Yeah. Publishers Weekly said that your prose dazzles and that you deliver an entertaining and informative look at various animals in this clever collection of essays. And the Boston Globe said readers will find these pages full of astonishments and will continue to think about these dogs and donkeys, tigers and lions, chickens and pigeons long after we close the book's covers. Fantastic. That's fantastic. What prompted you to pull together this book at this time? What was it that inspired you?
Well, 2 things, really. First of all, during COVID, I, like many people, got a puppy. And
Me too.
I mean, I would say almost everybody I know got a puppy. So I think in the course of getting this puppy and noticing how many people I knew were getting them, I began thinking, it's interesting, in a moment of crisis and a lot of worry and despair, that's what our impulse is, to get a pet. Naturally, you know, your mind starts sort of reviewing that. Isn't that interesting that that's how people respond to this kind of crisis? Mm-hmm. In addition, I think, like a lot of people during COVID, I was feeling very reflective and thinking about my life, what matters, what I've done professionally. And it struck me that one of the themes that I have revisited over and over again has been animals. And
Mm.
within a minute, it seemed very obvious to me that I could bring together these stories and that they would each kind of grow in their meaning when they were put between
Mhm.
covers.
Well, as someone who also adopted a puppy during the pandemic, my first dog ever, I found this book especially moving, but I don't think it's just a book for animal lovers. I mean, I think that this is a book that really resonates with anyone who wants to understand the world better.
Well, that was certainly my hope, and obviously, not any of these stories excludes people. They're all
Mhm.
stories about people, and they're also a bit about the way we live on the planet and
Mhm.
the history of our relationships with different creatures. So it's not the same as getting, a guide to housebreaking your new puppy at
Right.
all. It really is, you could argue it's also a bit of a travel log.
Mhm.
These stories take place all over the world, and they provide some insight into their location as much as they do into the people involved and the animals.
Oh, I was struck reading the stories how you begin the story thinking, "Oh, this is a story about mules." But really, it's a story about the war in Afghanistan, the US military's priorities, the ethics of breeding animals, animals as a commodity. There are so many layers to all of the stories that you're telling, and that's just one example. I mean, I think all of the stories, it's it's about one thing, you think, but it's really about so much else. And I wondered as a writer, at what point did that become clear to you? At what point were you inspired to write the story and then you realized it was much more than just that animal? Or what?
Well, it always begins for me with the story in a very focused way. There's a really specific event or character or circumstance that I want to look at. And it always is like, rather than a funnel where you start big and end up small,
Mhm.
it's sort of an inverted funnel
Mhm.
where I start small. I mean, for
Oh.
instance, the most recent story in the book is about an outbreak of a deadly disease
Mhm.
that is killing the rabbits of the world. It began with a very specific incident, which is this clinic in Manhattan that mostly treats rabbits had to shut down because 8 rabbits that were there suddenly died.
Mm.
The story, of course, first of all, I was very interested because you hear the word virus, and now we're all
Yeah.
super attuned to anything having to do with viruses. Instead of it being the singular incident, lo and behold, it turns out to be this global crisis that also led me into exploring the history of our relationship with rabbits, which is much more complicated than you would think.
Yep.
And also these are creatures that live literally everywhere on the planet and have been a major food source. They've been a hugely popular pet. So there were so many complexities, and then there also is the politics of vaccination,
Mhm.
and whether it's vaccinating yourself or in this case vaccinating your rabbit, it's complicated. The government is part of it, people's position on vaccination is part of it. So the story became huge, starting from this very specific incident of a couple of rabbits dying in Manhattan.
Mm.
I love stories like that. I
Oh,
love stories that teach me about history, about social circumstances, and that kind of grow from a very narrow opening.
I listened to an interview you did that you said a huge part of writing is the experience of learning something new, and it's the discovery that compels me. What is the biggest lesson that you've taken away from writing about animals from all of these years?
Uh, I would say the the lesson for me in writing is always the same, regardless of whether I'm writing about animals, about flowers, about whatever it is. And that is that, to me, the most compelling element of our life experience is learning.
Mm.
And the most important element of that experience of learning is curiosity. And to go back to what you said before, I don't think you need to love animals or have 5 dogs or, to be curious about any subject. And in this case, curious about subjects that happen to interface with the world of animals.
That is the word that I would use to describe you from reading your writing, is curious. Because when I did a search on the New Yorker website for articles by Susan Orlean, there's an origami piece, there's, luxury online shopping, Tanya Harding. I mean, it's you have so many different things that you've written about, and that seems to be the core of it all, is this idea of wanting to know more, being curious
Yeah.
about the world. And there are many people who are not like that. And I'm so curious how you sustain and how you fuel that curiosity about the world. How do you keep your inspiration and your interest going all the time?
In a way, it's a perpetual motion machine because, in the beginning, I will say, I think all of us fundamentally are a little bit lazy and a little drawn to what's familiar. I mean,
Mhm.
that's very natural, and it's certainly true for me. I think it's true for everybody. You gravitate toward what you know and what is comfortable. It's just, that's human. But every time I push past that to learn about something new, the reward is so huge that it helps each time I'm sort of struggling with that inner laziness to remember how good it feels to learn about something new. And it just keeps me always excited. I've never learned about something new and thought, wow, that was so boring and what a waste of time. I mean, it's interesting because if you think of it the way we look at travel, those of us who like to travel also generally like to be at home. And right before a trip, I always think, I really could be fine just staying at home.
Mhm.
I don't want to get on a plane. I don't want to deal with unfamiliar places and unfamiliar food. And, I think a lot of people have that 11th hour experience of saying, it really would be easier to stay home.
Mhm.
Even if you travel and you don't like where you've gone, you've learned something. You come back and say, you know what? I just realized I don't like Portugal or whatever it is.
Right.
And is that an experience you wish you had? I don't know. But in the long run, is it somehow enriching to say, I went to this place and the fact is, people talk a lot when they come back from a trip about what they didn't like.
It's true, we do.
And so it's not always, oh, I want to learn about this wonderful thing because it is wonderful. I think for me, it's, I want to learn about this thing.
Mm.
Come what may. I might find it wonderful. I might find it disappointing or disconcerting, but that experience of surprise
Mm.
is delicious. And, maybe those are the two ends of the spectrum in our lives, is comfort and familiarity versus surprise.
Right.
It's not a matter of comfort and familiarity versus super positive experience. I think it's really about the surprise and
Mhm.
feeling like, oh, there's a big world out there and I'm learning about it.
Were you always an animal lover as a child?
Very much. I didn't grow up with lots of animals. My mom was afraid of dogs, so we didn't get a dog until I was about 13.
Mm.
And we didn't have one of those households where there are a million animals around. It wasn't like that. But I was a big horseback rider when I was a kid, and I just loved animals and was always lobbying to get a dog and a cat and a horse and a mouse and a hamster and everything that you could have inside a house.
I heard that you have a soft spot for working animals. So the animals that live closely with humans. So that explains maybe why the book has stories about chickens and oxen and mules and dogs. What is it about these working animals that you connect with?
I find that relationship the most interesting. First of all, I think there's a kind of inherent nobility
Mm.
to livestock that I find very moving. I also think that's such an interesting relationship. It's not the same as the relationship we have with the animals who live inside our house. They are our family members, our dependents. We just have a different relationship with them, and that's very interesting too. But I'm fascinated by this rapport that we have with the animals that we work with, and there's a way that we've kind of negotiated a, an agreement with them that is very special. They're not wild animals, but they're not the pets in our home. They live in this other negotiated
Mhm.
space where we kind of cooperate. And I think that's really interesting.
We're also dependent on them for food, for work, and they're
And
dependent
they're
on us.
dependent on us. So
Yeah.
it is a different I mean, similarly, I will say, I think one of the most moving things in the world is seeing a working dog, a dog that is a seeing eye dog or a search and rescue
Mhm.
dog. And I adore my dogs, but they don't work for me. We don't have an agreement. They bark when someone rings the front doorbell.
Yes.
But there is something fascinating to me to see an animal and a human that have come to an agreement about how to sort of work together.
Mhm.
And so it's really interesting to explore that.
I'm always a sucker for those stories about, the person who is drowning and the dog goes and gets them help, or the child that's lost and the dog that helps them get to the police or something. Those stories where you hear about someone being saved by an animal in their life. There's something about that that speaks to their humanity and their, I don't know, their gifts that they give us that maybe we don't appreciate enough.
Yeah, I think that animals have certainly domestic animals, and there have been some instances where this is true with wild animals, have an innate empathy that is very, it's demonstrable. I mean, it's not just our imagination. And anybody who has even the most spoiled pet dog, if you throw yourself on your bed sobbing because you're upset, I guarantee you that your dog will come over and investigate what's going on and, you know, offer themselves as comfort to you.
Yeah.
And that's nothing we train them to do. They have a response that, you could say, well, it's just instinct. It's nothing more than that. But so it still functions as a way of showing care.
Mhm.
I have this crazy puppy who's pretty, he's a handful. And he's a terrier, and terriers, unlike a spaniel or a lab, they don't immediately kind of dote on you.
Mhm.
They're very independent. So a couple of months ago, the dog, he squirted out of our front door and was dashing up our steps. And my husband went lunging after him and tripped and fell really hard on the
Oh.
step. The dog, who, you know, had this taste of freedom and was ready to go running down the street, turned around and came back to see. He heard my husband fall, and I assume my husband must have yelled out. I wasn't here, so I missed it. And he said it was incredible. The puppy came down to see if he was okay. And that
Oh.
to me was a really interesting example, because the puppy had run out the front door because he wanted to go run down the street. And then
Right.
he sort of resisted his impulse to come back and check on my husband. And we look at that every time he's being impossible and think, but remember, he did come check on you. He's got a heart of gold.
There you did an interview with David Remnick about this book, and we have the link. We'll put it underneath. And you said the miracle of writing nonfiction is that facts are just so fantastic. And indeed, there's so much that happens in these stories that could be unbelievable. For example, there's this story called Lost Dog, which as a new dog owner, I got like, oh no, lost dog. But it's really it's hopeful at the end. But it's about you follow the search of a dog that's gone missing, and the story includes a stolen car, a CDC epidemiologist, a viola, and a pet detective named Sherlock Bones. So if you were writing that in a fiction class, people would be like, oh no, you won't, that's too crazy, that's like
Right.
too crazy. Have you ever, but it's true, have you ever in your writing career thought no one would believe a story that you're writing, like, oh, this is just too, it's too unreal, it's too preposterous?
It's really funny. I mean, that's a great point, because sometimes things are just so good that you think, I would never have the nerve to make this up if I were writing fiction, for that very reason, that you would think people would say, oh, that's too crazy. And, you know, real life is pretty interesting. And when you have a pet detective named Sherlock Bones, and the circumstance of this story, which was really sounded like a fable, because it was so, it had so many funny little odd details, that if I
Mhm.
were writing a story about a lost dog, I wouldn't have had the nerve to also put in a viola and a car and the, you know, what ended up unfolding. Luckily, I've never run into a problem of people doubting what I've written. I think that is partly credit going to the New Yorker and the other publications I've written for, that people trust and know
Mhm.
that we don't fabricate, we don't make composite characters, we don't put in odd, funny details because they're odd and funny, but that, you know, we go through a very rigorous fact checking. And I think people read those stories confident that, as crazy as a detail may be, that they know it's true.
Yep.
And that really helps. And for me as a reader and as a writer, I want people to savor the kind of craziness of real life,
Mhm.
and to enjoy and just luxuriate in the kind of, the fact that real life is really that amazing,
Yeah.
and that, you know, stories are remarkable when they're fiction, but they're even more remarkable when they're factual, and you think,
Mhm.
this is incredible. I mean, a little detail, for instance, in that rabbit story about this extraordinary virus that's spread worldwide and killed millions and millions of rabbits, and that it started with a French doctor who was irritated that these rabbits were eating his vegetable garden. So he caught one and injected it with this virus, and that virus literally went from this rabbit in the garden, which is like reading a Peter Rabbit story, and farmer whatever his name was, who would get mad at the rabbits, and then spread around the world. And you think that that would read like science fiction, except it wasn't science fiction, it was real. It really happened. And I think that is where, in a way, reading nonfiction is like the best kind of education. You learn amazing stuff, but it's presented to you in a form that's exciting and narrative, and where you are learning, maybe in spite of yourself, that you're, discovering these remarkable facts about the world that are really real.
Yeah. I mean, that story and that particular doctor's response to his infestation of rabbits, especially with this COVID experience, and you look at it and you think, geez, you just could have bought a fence. I mean, like, it's like would have been better on so many levels. But it really is, I think, getting to this question of how people react and how everyone has different responses, and they may not be the response that you have, but you can learn a little bit more about other people through this process of reading.
Right. And also on the additional level of us becoming very conscious of the transmissibility of viruses, and that now the idea that you would inject a wild animal with a virus and you think, what, are you kidding? That's insane. And we know a lot more now, for better or worse, that you don't mess around with a virus.
What was it like for you to sit down and pull together these stories? Did you revisit the topics, and because I know I Googled some of these stories. Like, I want to know where the tiger lady of New Jersey is, and what's up with the lion guy from South Africa.
Yeah.
With a YouTube channel. Like, did you do that yourself and sort of investigate where these subjects are now?
I didn't well, I should say, in the course of putting together the collection, I made a decision early on that I wasn't going to do a sort of afterwards on each one. I really wanted this to be a collection of these stories essentially as they appeared. And if there was any error, I mean, there were no errors that I was aware of, but I would have certainly corrected those. I edited them for language just to smooth out places that were bumpy, but I made the decision that I wasn't going to do an afterwards. But I'm always fascinated after I've done a story with what happens once I walk away. Once you've spent the time that I spend on these stories, I remain perpetually interested in the subject.
How do your stories come to be? Do you pitch them to an editor? Does an editor suggest them to you? What's that process like?
The New Yorker has a long tradition of the stories being generated by the writers. And I think that is why it's such a good magazine, because people are writing the stories that they feel really strongly about, that they are passionate about, and rather than getting an assignment where you sort of go and diligently do your work, but you don't come to it with your own native enthusiasm. And that's a wonderful thing. It also means that the onus of finding good stories is on all of us. I look for stories everywhere. I would say that I'm always listening to the world, reading, catching conversations, thinking about things I look at through the lens of, oh, that would be an interesting story. I
Mm.
want to know more about that. And it can be as varied as reading a little mention in a newspaper, seeing a flyer on a bulletin board,
Mm.
overhearing a casual conversation. And, I think it's by nature and by training, my reaction is to say, oh, that would make an interesting story.
Mm.
And it can be in almost any environment. Stories often catch me by surprise. In the case of, as I mentioned about the rabbit story, it was, my stepson's rabbit was not able to go to the vet because the clinic was closed. And my thought was, why is the vet clinic closed? That's
Mm.
weird. In the case of writing about the American Humane Film and Television Unit that
Mhm.
oversees the way animals are cared for on film sets. It was a simple matter of sitting at a movie one day and watching the credits roll by. And when the no animals were harmed popped up on screen, all of a sudden I thought, oh, I wonder how they decide that. I mean, I've seen it, like
Ah.
all of us, I've seen that a million times, and I never had any idea of who declared that no animal was harmed. And I suddenly thought, wow, that's an interesting story. I mean, somebody is giving that seal of approval. Who is it, and how do they do it? And that led to that story. So it can be something familiar that I stop and think, wow, I never thought about that before. Or it can be a mention of something quite surprising. In the case of the tiger lady in New Jersey, there was a little news report about a tiger that was spotted in a suburban town in New Jersey.
Mhm.
And I thought, whoa, that's pretty weird. And then I learned a little more about it and thought, wow, this is an incredible story.
So your strategy is, it sounds like you're alive in the world. You're paying attention, and your tentacles are sort of talking about animals. So your tentacles are sort of alert and sort of taking stock of what's going on in the world and around you, and to get your inspiration.
And I think tentacles or antenna are the perfect metaphor, because I do feel that I have this little force field around me that's always, it's not a clinical thing of thinking, uh, is this a story? It's not quite as predatory as that, as much as it is responding to my own curiosity. I mean, the thing with the film No Animals Were Harmed, that initially was just me thinking, oh, like I've seen that a million times, but I never thought about it before. Who declares that no animal was harmed? And then my second thought was, oh, that would be a cool story to find out about that. So it is always initially me responding to the world
Mm.
in a curious way, and then having that second beat of thinking, oh, that could be a cool story.
Is there a white whale for your reporting? Is there something that you've long wanted to write about, but you haven't been able to get to it?
Oh, that's a great question. No, not that I can think of. And I think that I don't have a sort of wish list. I think people, for instance, you do a lot of profiles, they may have a wish list of the people who they would most want to interview. I don't have that. I mean, there are places I'd love to go. There are people I'd love to talk to. There are circumstances I'd be curious to explore, but I don't have that that kind of punch list of things that are my unrequited curiosities.
This book is a master class in first lines. I mean, they're fantastic. And you in an interview said that the opening graph, the lead, you call it the seductive entry point for your stories. And I mean, your first stop, they tell the reader, sit down, buckle up, this is going to be good. Pay attention. I mean, that's what I think about when I mean, when I read these stories, several times I stopped and I said, "Wait, what did I just read?" And I went back and I wanted to just read a few for our audience because they're just so great. This one I love. As soon as the 2003 World Taxidermy Championships opened, the heads came rolling in the door. If I were a donkey, the donkey I'll never forget was coming around a corner in the walled city of Fez, Morocco, with 6 colored televisions strapped on his back. This one, very famous. I'm sure if I were a bitch, I'd be in love with Biff Truesdale. I mean, there are so many, Susan. These are so terrific. I could go on and on, actually. I have a very long list here. We're going to spend the whole time me telling you and the audience how much I love your first lines. I'm so curious, how do they come about? Do these come to you in the middle of the night? This is the first line. This is where I should start. Do you edit to get there? How do they come to life?
Well, they do. First of all, thank you. Of course, I'm extremely flattered. And I do care a lot about those first sentences. So it's not accidental. It's not something where I think, oh my goodness, wow, I never thought about that, because I think about them a lot. Many times they are something where just boom, it clicks in my head. And then I do an enormous amount of polishing and, kind of tooling it to work exactly how I want it to work. But the basic kind of nugget that's at the center of it comes very much out of the blue. And the thing that's challenging about that then is you don't know quite how they came about. And a lot of times when people say, well, how did you come up with the one for Biff Truesdale? And I think, I don't know. It just suddenly struck me. And I can sort of reverse engineer an answer and say, well, here I am writing about a show dog. And we all have this little bit of an sort of immature reaction to the use of the word bitch when we're talking about a female dog, because it's also a curse word. And I think it just all, and also I was in love with this dog. He was beautiful. He was very charismatic. And it just kind of then popped into my head. And then, of course, I worked hard to make sure it was precisely what I wanted. But the idea, I think it must bubble up subconsciously.
Can I read one more?
Yes.
I really love them. Okay, this one's great. Well, they're all great. If I had never seen Janet Bonney reenact the mouth to beak resuscitation of her hen number 7, who had been frozen solid in a snowstorm, then was thawed and nursed back to life, being hand-fed and massaged as she watched doctor shows on TV, I might never have become a chicken person. I mean, I'm not a chicken person, and I'm kind of like, maybe I should get a chicken after reading that.
That's so funny. And that was a sentence. It's a good one to pick. It's so long and it involves so many images and it's so complex that I made the decision that was the sentence, but I worked on it forever, getting it, to track properly, because it's a complicated sentence. And I really did want to start with this crazy, like down the wormhole sort of sentence. I didn't want a short sentence like I love chickens, or, which I guess that could have been a lead as well. But I liked the insane sort of swirling, mad tea party quality. Also, it really was so amazing, this scene of this woman reenacting how she saved her chicken. It was something where I thought, I can't believe I've seen this. I mean, it's so crazy. But I also thought, well, I'm getting a chicken, and I did.
You never gave your chicken mouth to beak.
No, I did kiss my chickens frequently, not on the beak, but I would when I would pick them up, I would kiss them, and then the CDC put out an advisory, or the USDA, I can't remember who it was, telling people not to kiss their chickens because of the possibility of catching different salmonella from them. And I think there was one other disease. And to go back to the topic of disease, and people were, I mean, first of all, I don't think most people think about kissing a chicken. And yet, if you have a chicken, and if some of your chickens are snuggly, not all of them are, but a few of my chickens were really, they loved being held and cuddled. And then you sort of kiss them on the side of their head. And then suddenly they're, the USDA put out this warning because evidently they know that a lot of people kiss their chickens.
I had no idea. I had no idea that people kiss their chickens or that chickens were snuggly.
Nor did I. I mean, you just don't think of them that way at all. But I had a few that were very shy, and I never even picked them up. And then I had some that were, they could have stayed in my arm all day. They were very, they just enjoyed it. They liked being held and sort of cuddled, and they feel great. Their feathers are amazingly sleek and really quite wonderful, and they weigh nothing. They literally weigh nothing, so you can kind of hang on to them for a very long time. I have a lot of pictures of me holding my chickens.
We always love to ask our guests what books they're reading and what they can recommend to our audience. So obviously we want our audience to pick up on animals, and we're going to include a link below the broadcast to buy this from Skylight Books in LA, because I understand that's your local indie bookstore, Susan.
Yeah.
But there are, and I personally will tell you that I have purchased this book as a gift for a family member for Christmas already. And so it's absolutely a great recommendation for the holidays. We also want to know what you're reading. What is something else that's on your to read pile, or what you're looking forward to reading, something that you read during the pandemic that brought you?
Oh my God, I read so many great things during the pandemic. One of my favorites was Night Boat to Tangier by Kevin Barry. I read a lot of fiction, I should say.
Oh, interesting. You write nonfiction.
Yeah, I read more fiction than nonfiction, although I did read fantastic nonfiction books during COVID too, including Hidden Valley Road by Robert Kolker. That's just, you can't put it down. I read a brilliant book called We Germans by Alexander Starrett. That's fantastic. I just started Trust Exercise by Susan Choi.
Ooh, that's good.
Yeah. And The Paying Guest by Sarah Waters.
Okay.
That came out some time ago. And The Association of Small Bombs by Karen Maharan, which is an incredible book. So I've read some great stuff.
Okay. We're coming to the end of our time, which breaks my heart. And also I've taken up all the time. So my apologies to the audience for not scooting in your questions. But if I can just ask you a couple more things, Susan. One is that I read today that you are now writing a new column for the New Yorker, an obituary column. Can you explain what that is to our audience?
Yes. Well, I love taking existing forms and sort of exploring them. And I think that, an obituary is this extraordinary narrative. Mm-hmm. And I don't know about you, but I read them all the time.
I do. I read them every weekend in the New York Times.
I mean, I think that you learn about lives you would never have learned about. And, everybody has a story. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times it's only at these dramatic inflection points in lives do we journalistically pay attention?
Right.
They're when someone's born, someone gets married, someone dies. And the New Yorker has never, we occasionally do obituaries if somebody, you know, they have over time done obituaries, but they've never had a column. And it dawned on me that it would be a fascinating form to explore and would give me an excuse to write about a lot of lives that would otherwise not be big enough to warrant a big profile, a big story. But the sort of form of an obituary really gives you the opportunity to write about anything. You
That
know,
sounds exciting.
it is exciting. I mean, it's a big undertaking, and I think it's going to be really interesting. I think it's going to be a new way of looking at stories for me, and so that's exciting.
Another way of looking at stories is when you take a book and you adapt it for television. And I understand that you were involved in that process for the library book.
Yes.
Well, how is that? What's that like to, you write this book and then you're translating that for the screen? Do you enjoy that process?
It's been really interesting. And I'm a bit of a rookie, so I'm learning a lot. One of the things that's very surreal as somebody who's always written, you know, very factually and complete adherent to fact is fact. The thing with the screenplay is that you can make anything happen. You are the puppet master. You can say, you know what, instead of this character being a 40-year-old woman, let's make it a 70-year-old man. And instead of them meeting downtown, we'll have them meet somewhere. I mean, there's this strange, a kind of magical power that you have to move pieces in place as you wish. There's also a whole different demand for dialogue to tell the story as opposed to the exposition of a piece of prose. So that's a really interesting thing. Nothing happens in a movie except visually or dialogue. And, you know, as opposed to a piece of prose where much of what happens is the writer telling the story. So it's kind of this interesting, weird inversion of the writing process.
How lucky you are to have all these opportunities to constantly be learning.
It's awesome.
It's really
awesome. It's really, I mean, what could be better? It's really fun, and it's fun to say, this is something I don't know how to do, and I'm going to try to do it.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being
here. Everyone will fail along with me until I get good at it.
You won't fail. It'll be great. I can't wait to watch it.
Awesome.
Speaking of great, on animals, perfect for the animal lover or the person who's just curious about the world in your life for the holidays. And Susan, thank you so much for being with us today. I'm thrilled to have this time with you. And also happy birthday. I understand it's your birthday this weekend.
Yes, I'm a Halloween baby. So I am getting no costume for me except being a birthday girl. So I'm pretty excited. And, you know, Halloween is a kind of something that everybody enjoys. So it's a nice holiday birthday rather than, say, Christmas or something where you feel jealous because everybody's celebrating something else. To me, it just feels like a celebration.
Are you team candy corn or team never eat candy corn?
I love candy corn. So, you know, yeah. I mean, how could you not love candy corn? I don't get it. You know, just makes no sense to me. It's an excellent food product. So
Well, it's your birthday. You can do whatever you want and eat whatever
Right.
candy you want. So enjoy. Thank you again for being here. Thank you to our audience for being with us today. Again, pick up your copy of On Animals. And to our audience, if you enjoyed today's show, and we hope that you did, please subscribe to A Mighty Blazes page on Facebook to hear more updates about our upcoming conversations with authors. And if you're not a Facebook person, hop over to amightyblaze.com to subscribe to our newsletter, and then you can watch all of our upcoming events on YouTube. Join us back here next week for more conversations with authors and the books we love here on A Mighty Blaze. Susan Orlean, thank you so much, and have a great weekend. Bye, everyone. And happy Halloween and happy birthday. We have to say that one more time.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks so much, Kimberly.